Okay, folks, this is Book Talk with Corbin. I'm your host, and we have with us today a sister who's with the African National Women's Organization. She told me, she pronounced her name and spelled her name to me, and unfortunately, I'm not bilingual. I only understand Kentucky English. So I'm just going to, throughout the interview, just call her sister or my sister, and she'll give us her name. And again, she's the president with the African National Women's Organization. Their website is anwouhuru.org. And the reason why we're having her on is because of a book I came across written by Dorothy Roberts, and it's called Torn Apart: How the Child Welfare System Destroys Black Families and How Abolition Can Build a Safer World. If you're pretty much a black person in an urban area, you can probably recite a horror story or two about child protective services in a black family. I can't. And this sister here, her organization, they're dead in the battle against this whole attack from Child Protective Services, the overall child welfare system, against black children, black families, black mothers, black fathers. I don't have a lot of political agreement with her, but her work has to be promoted. More and more black folk in the United States, we have to know about this. And I think what's really important is not only that we know about it, that we know that we can get behind an organization like hers, who's in the front line in this battle. And I honestly can't think of a more important front line, speaking as a father, than protecting our children. Sister, thank you for being here. Thank you for letting me go on my little rant there. This isn't about me. This is not about people hearing from me, but people hearing from you. You're the president of this organization. Go ahead and pronounce your name for us, please, sister.
Or is Yejide Orunmila.
Okay. And I went on a little rant there about black families, black children, and child protective services. Did I exaggerate a little bit? Did I get it wrong?
You did not get it wrong. We are actually in the throes of a crisis. We've always been experiencing this crisis. Black children have been taken from us since the first Africans were brought to this country and taken away and used as labor. And this is the same thing that's continuing to this day, and we call it the new auction block. With child policing services, child family policing services has been used as the motive force to enter into our communities under the premise of ranking whether or not we are good parents or not, based on colonial practices that basically criminalizes black people, steals black children, commodifies black bodies, and rips the foundation of the black community apart. And because this is not a murder, because this is not something that is right versus wrong in terms of like how people understand things. Somebody's dead, police shot him, right versus wrong. Mm-hmm. When we talk about the contradictions that exist within our community that makes people open and vulnerable to child protective services, we have a lot of people in our community that we have to convince them that this is an issue that we have to take on. The moment is here, and we have to stand up for our communities, because if we say that the police sometimes are wrong in instances of police shootings, we can't say that the same state that employs police, the same state that disproportionately targets black folks, is now right in the instances where they are taking black children out of our homes.
And when you say, based upon what you just said, and I hope it's okay for me to say this, if anybody thinks that she's off base, you need to pick up this book, Torn Apart, and also another book called Shattered Bonds, written by the same author. I tell you, I've read a good part of Torn Apart, and I just read some synopsis on Shattered Bonds. I don't see how anybody cannot any black person with a conscience cannot see that this is an absolutely critical situation.
Yes.
Even if people aren't in political agreement with you, sister,
Mhm.
there's something wrong going on here. Period.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think one of the things that we are always confronted by is, well, what did she do? What did he do? Oh,
Right.
they was on drugs. They was, I'm just like, well, we have to look at the foundation of why these people are like, not everybody whose children are taken are on drugs or are violent or have
Right.
starved or abused children.
That's
There
right.
are some people who we've worked with who might have contradictions like alcohol abuse or drug addiction, but they value their children. They're just fighting an addiction. But
Yeah.
these are the conditions that were imposed upon our communities because we all know for a fact that the drug economy was imposed on Black communities throughout the world by the U.S. government. So any contradictions that we're experiencing because of the drugs or whatever is something that was imposed on us that creates the conditions under which the state now comes in and takes our children.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to recognize that we can't give any space to the state, because when we do allow them to take that inch, they will go for a mile and they will justify in every single case the basis for why these children are taken. And we recognize that our community want our children to be safe. We
Mm-hmm.
recognize that nobody wants our children, like if there's a question of whether somebody is a fit parent or not, that our community um, uh, problem is, I want my children to be safe, but we all know that child protective services is not good. So what
Right.
do we have?
Right.
you know, like
Right.
nobody said, I'm gonna call CPS, and everybody's like, oh, that's a good idea. Nobody
Right.
ever said that.
You're right.
Nobody.
You're right about that, sister. You're right about that. You're absolutely
So,
right about
so
And
then we have to
let me
go
follow
ahead.
up on that a little bit. Let's run with that point a little bit. And I think it was before we actually officially started this interview. I said to you, you probably could just throw a rock 2-3 feet in any direction. You hit a black person, they can tell you a horror story about CPS and the black family. And one of them, and this is talked a lot about in this book, Torn Apart by Dorothy Roberts. Once the children get into the system, then it takes an act of God to get those, for the families to get those children back.
Listen.
Sister, we ain't got enough time. I could tell you 2 cases right now.
Mm-hmm.
One of them was where a woman, I'm not exaggerating, sis, it was 2 years. She did everything them people asked of her, and then some.
Mm-hmm.
And she, at a frustration, she started going to different clinics, begging them, please help me. What do you want me to do? I'll do it. I'll do it again, and I'll do it again. And then, a black female professional, she told me, she said, brother, let me tell you something. That's not an uncommon situation.
It's not. It's not. And
So why is that, sis? What is it about what do they hope to gain? Hey, I'm going to take this child, then I'm going to keep them in the system and make it as difficult as heck to get that child back with their family, his or her family.
well, first of all, I think we should look at it from the angle of money. That when children are taken into the system, that the funding for CPS organizations in every single state is federally funded. So they count the amount of children that are currently in their care, and they get money from the federal government for the amount of children that's in their care. So the longer that they hold the child, the more money that they're able to build into their budget. One. Number two, I think that the legal and law purposes are slighted. They are laws were created in against that disproportionately targets Black and Brown communities. So when somebody's like, oh, well, if somebody's using drugs, I'm like, yeah, well, a lot of the places where people do a lot of surveillance around drugs is in African or Black communities around the country. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's where, and a lot of the poverty are rooted in Black and Brown communities around the country. And that's where a lot of the CPS targeting is. And so when they hold on to our children, I think it's a COINTELPRO sort of response that really burst out of the 1970s, out of that military defeat of the Black Revolution then. And then I think that I also know that it's a question of resources, money, and how people fill their budgets. And that's the same thing that we can really harken back to, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, when we were enslaved peoples. And, our bodies were used as a way to make money and were money. And so today we're still seeing the same thing.
Sis, and I need to be delicate in asking this question. Am I wrong in seeing that most CPS workers are white females?
Actually, in our experience, we see it depends on where you are in the country. Now, if you're in a white place, obviously the CPS workers are white. But the families that we work with, they are conflicted because there's Black women who are in these positions taking the children, Black people, mostly Black women. And this creates a most toxic environment because the relationships between our people who work for the system and the people who are being targeted by the system are very close knit. We look like each other. And so a lot of people have say this Black people taking my child.
Wow.
The Black people taking my child. And we've not had an instance where we've had to really contend with the white social worker, even though that's not odd. We've seen them and we know that they exist. But the ones that we work with primarily are Black social workers.
Wow, it's interesting. It's an interesting it's an interesting thought. And also, when I was reading this book, Torn Apart, it talked about there seems to be a tendency based on policy. Well, let's remove the child immediately. As opposed to saying, okay, well, the child's there. Let's see if we can get some services to help the family. Are you seeing? Please comment on that for us, please.
Yeah. So we've been involved with cases where a mother was coming home from her day of shopping with her child, and she's met by a social worker who was on a front porch and with a police officer. And before she puts her key in the door, her child was snatched out of her arms, taken into her car. She's handed a piece of paper and says, meet me here at this time at such and such, and this is the reason, just really having to deal with the trauma of having one's child taken.
Yes.
And it's not an uncommon experience. Like, we see people who had their doors kicked in. We've seen landlords who shut off water to an apartment, then call CPS because he wants this person out of this apartment. So he calls CPS and says, "This ain't no water in the apartment." And when you ain't got no water in the apartment, that's the grounds for taking. That's the grounds for neglect.
Right.
And so, yeah, this immediate thing of let me take the child. But what we also see is that in cases where they take the child, maybe for domestic violence, which is another thing for women that we've seen, that they take the child and then there's no more domestic violence. The man is out of the house. She's gotten rid of that problem, but they don't give the child back. You have to go through all these programs.
Yes.
And then if something else comes up, say for example, you might have started drinking because you're sad and you're depressed if they find out, now that becomes a thing why they can't return the child, even though that wasn't the thing that had the child taken out of your house in the first place.
Right.
So there's this ongoing thing that happens over and over again that makes it really difficult. Act of God, like you says, to try to get these kids out of child policing services.
I tell you, I've seen it. I know of a woman who, actually her family called in on her, and the reason why they called in on her I thought was ridiculous, but one thing I noticed, I immediately said, well, if you're that concerned about the children's welfare, why didn't you just approach her and say, hey, how can we help? What can we do? Taking them away was not, I thought it was too extreme. They took her kids out of the school system. She actually called me upset. This lady's come and talked to me, blah, blah, blah. And then I said, where are your children? And she said, they're at school. And I said, you better go check. And they had snatched her children. They had snatched
there's these surveillance of things that are set up in hospitals and schools where teachers and medical professionals are used to surveil families and report on families. So even in the case where we had a mother who had some medical issues with her child, she goes to the hospital for help and her child is
Yes.
taken away.
Yes.
And, and so it just really creates a lot of unparent, like it just takes away, it just creates unmothers and unfathers.
Yes.
It's really a devastating thing because it doesn't just impact the parents, it impacts the entire community, your extended family, because
Yes.
people might feel a certain kind of way about you. And
Mhm.
then sometimes also the community and even your family can use it as a retaliatory practice. They'll use it
Mm.
against you.
Yes. And
So
like
that's
you
what
said earlier, the trauma
oh
a
yeah.
mother must feel in someone just snatching her child and going away.
I
And
couldn't imagine.
yeah, and the child, like, this is mama, this is safety, this is comfort. Boom. I'm just taken from her.
And that's the thing. There was a study that said that even if your parents have issues, children don't want to be removed from their parents.
Yes.
Even if they going through some stuff, they feel safest there. And it's documented also that children are safest with their parents as opposed
Yes.
to a strange house with people who they don't know. And you
Exactly.
don't even know where you're going into foster care. And there's been documented cases where people who are foster parents are not fit to be taking care of somebody
That's
else's
right.
children.
That's right. You're absolutely right about that. Sis, again, please give us your website again. Where now can people go to this website and make a donation?
Yes.
Okay.
So our website is Anwo Uhuru, and I'll spell it out, ANWOUHURU.org. That's the African National Women's Organization. Our campaign that focuses on this is called hashtag Arrest CPS. And you can specifically donate to this campaign. We have a national march on Washington, D.C. on Mother's Day on May 8th coming up in about a week and a half.
Oh, okay.
It's called Black Mothers March on the White House. Everybody's welcome who is in support of this anti-CPS work.
Yeah.
And we welcome anybody to come out to that. And you can find out more information about that from our website, but you can also go directly to blackmothersmarch.com to find out.
Blackmothersmarch.com.
Yes.
Okay. Last question here, my sister. Has CPS sort of said anything to you or people in your organization, or are they just sort of like, let's stay away from them?
We've on a few occasions we've been in contact with workers. We've actually been protest outside of outside of CPS offices, and we've had some social workers who contest with us. Like, you don't know these families. You don't, it's nasty. So all of it's nasty. It's never not nasty.
Mm-hmm.
We have people who may not have approached us in that way, but might see us online, and it's like, well, yeah, I know it's bad, but I don't see any other way because there's no other sort of infrastructure to deal with any issues in our community that could be more holistic. And so that's why we promote, we have something called the Uhuru Kijiji Child Care Collective,
Mm-hmm.
where that's community control of child welfare. Where if we say CPS is trash, then what are we creating in this stead so that we can address these things that are happening in our community? Because if we
Mm.
don't create something else, then we're just leaving it open, and we don't create an answer to any issues that may be in our community. So that's what
Yeah.
we really are focused on too.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time today. We will, with the final edit of this video, we will be putting up the address of both websites, and I want to encourage people to please contact that organization, get information, make a donation. Any amount helps. Any amount helps. Don't sit there and say, "Oh, my $5 or my $50, my $500 ain't going to help." It all helps. It helps. And I also want to encourage people to buy these books: "Shattered Bonds," "The Color of Child Welfare," and "Torn Apart: How the Child Welfare System Destroys Black Families." Both those books are by Dorothy Roberts. My sister, thank you again. I hope we can do this again sometime.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
Yes,
Appreciate it.
ma'am.
Have a good one.